Hi, my name is Cynthia Paces, and I teach history at the College of New Jersey. And the book is Prague, the Heart of Europe. So basically, I like to say that the book is about the whole history of Prague from about when the riverbed formed in the Ice Age to yesterday. So it's a really long durée history of one city. And I try to emphasize certain strands that I follow throughout the book. The impact of art and architecture on the city, how that city becomes almost layered in history because there isn't too much of a movement to replace things. There's just an adding and adding onto the landscape. And so it's one of the few cities in Europe, especially because it survived intact for the most part, World War II, that has, Romanesque buildings, Gothic, Renaissance, Baroque, and then some really modern, interesting art from the 20th and 21st centuries. Well, I've been working on Central European history and specifically Czechoslovakia and Prague really since I was a graduate student, but my interest goes even further back than that. So my father was actually born in Prague in 1943 during the war, and his family immigrated here in 1951. So they were refugees. They lived in a refugee camp in Germany after the war. And so it was always part of my childhood that I had, my father was from this interesting place. But given the political situation, people in my family never wanted to go back. And then also my mom's side of the family is American, Irish, going, back to the 19th century. So we didn't have both parents speaking the language. And so I didn't learn it growing up, but I was always interested. And then when I was at university, I was taking history courses, and that's when all of the changes took place in Eastern Europe. So I was literally taking a course on the history of communist and socialist thought in the fall of 1989. And, the Berlin Wall came down, and my professor said, yeah, but nothing's going to happen in Czechoslovakia and Romania. They're really hardliners. And then all of a sudden that all changed. And so I was sort of propelled by those events. So I had this personal background, but then sort of my academic background really began in this pivotal historical moment. And then when I went to graduate school, that was when the wars were happening in Yugoslavia. Czechoslovakia broke into two republics. So I followed nationalism and, so I've really been working on this issue for a long, long time. I also like to tell the story of the people who lived there. And obviously I have to do a lot with, the leaders, but I also tried to find the stories of people who aren't always included in history. There are a lot of stories about women who made Prague. I also try as much as I can to kind of talk about the actual people who built Prague. So when they talk about Charles IV built the Charles Bridge, really he, hired workers to do that. So I try, it's a history that does a lot. It's social, it's cultural, it's political. So it was a big project. I was very fortunate. Oxford has been working on sort of commissioning what they're calling biographies of world cities. So there's been one that came out last year about Venice, and I know some other colleagues are working on Vienna and Budapest. So I had written an earlier book about Prague, and it was much more tightly focused around the 20th century. And I got this email that said, book about Prague, and it was Oxford University Press in the, from line. And I thought it was going to be an advertisement. And I was like, I wonder who wrote a book about Prague. And then it was this, do you have any interest? And, it was just this moment that as a historian and a writer, like, you don't think is going to happen. So I keep saying it's sort of, the book was like a dream come true that I didn't really know that I had. One is my grandfather. He and I spent time together in Prague in the 1990s, and he had owned a small business, and it had been taken over by the communists. And that's how he ended up kind of in this political group that was opposing the government, and he had to leave the country. And he really never thought that he would ever go back. And my grandmother had passed away a lot earlier, and it happened that I was studying there when he first came for the first time. And he definitely, encouraged me to study history. And but it was also just very, very emotional to see him there at that time. He was probably about 80 years old, and he had built this sort of small workshop that was part of their house that made after dinner drinks, so like cordials and things like that. And so like he was seeing sort of the, almost ruins of it, like the house hadn't been well kept up. And there was just a lot of his nostalgia for the city. So I got to experience that firsthand. So kind of almost telling the story of the city itself is a tribute to my grandparents and my father, my uncles, whose lives were really affected by the major events of the 20th century. And then as I was studying, Václav Havel was elected president of Czechoslovakia and then the Czech Republic. But I had, before any of that happened, I had heard about him as a dissident and playwright. And I was writing a paper in this history of socialism class that I had told you about his philosophy and his plays. And my professor said, I'm not sure, I don't know who he is. I mean, people knew him in the West, but you had to sort of be kind of a theater person or really following the specific politics. And he said, well, but if you can find stuff, you can write the paper on it. And when I came back from our Thanksgiving break, he was like leading the protests and being elected president. And I said to my professor, like, now do you know who he is? So just his philosophy of civil society and this just true belief in democracy and human rights was just so inspiring to me at a young age. So, he is somebody that plays a role, obviously, in the end part of the book. And one of the last stories I tell is actually about his funeral. And there are places in the book where I talk about the funeral of Charles IV and then Tomáš Masaryk, who was the first Czechoslovak president, and then Havel as these kind of moments where the country kind of comes together, and as opposed to like nationalism, which has a lot of negative connotations, but like a real feeling of civil society and community. One thing that was really exciting for me, because as you can tell, I am more of a modernist, and I'm, comfortable in like the 19th, 20th centuries. But I had to go back and I had to learn medieval history. I had to really understand the structure of the state at a period of time that I had never really studied before. And in doing that, I discovered, just some really fascinating people. And one was somebody named Elizabeth Weston, who actually was an English woman. And she lived in Prague during the reign of Rudolph II. And she became a well-known poet and the first woman to be a poet laureate in the Habsburg monarchy. And her father, no, her stepfather was one of the alchemists who came to Prague to, sort of discover what was happening there. And their story is interesting, but sort of told again and again. But her stepfather was Edward Kelly, and he believed in educating women. And so she was educated in English, German, Czech, and Latin. And she started writing these Latin poems, and people just don't know her. And some of her poems are about Prague. She was there during some of the worst flooding that the city had seen, and she writes about the river and the damage that the floods had on the city. But she also writes about the sort of illusions of art, and has this poem about that a bird could fly into a painting and hit themselves in the head, because the bird can't know what a painting is. But that's the sort of beauty of being human, that we can recognize something as art, even if it looks like something. It's more than that object. It's something that is part of human creation. So I was really taken by her. And then she ended up marrying young and dying in childbirth fairly young after having a number of children, which is, such a typical, unfortunately, ending for many women who did push the boundaries. It may sound cliche, but like really believe in yourself, that you can do a big project, and it will take time, and it will take effort, and there will be frustrations along the way, but you can do it. The other more practical, I would say, is that I've been very fortunate to be part of an online writing group. It's called Shared Space. It's something a colleague created, and we carve out a time every Wednesday morning, and we write together for 2 hours. And we just know that we have that space that we've held for that purpose. And we share our goals with each other, and we then report back on how we did. And sometimes with work, teaching and other things, maybe you haven't actually gotten back to that writing since the last Wednesday, but like, that space is going to be there. So we kind of always say that we hold that space, no meetings on Wednesday mornings.